I'm Debbie Offner. I've been the consulting psychologist here since 2003. I'm the only person on the panel who's not an alum. But in fact, Commonwealth has provided me with an education, a journey, and wonderful, often unexpected opportunities for growth. Colleagues, students, and alums expose me to new ways of thinking and different ways of being that keep me from ever settling into complacency or even any kind of a routine. So I'm delighted and honored to introduce this evening's panelists. Stephanie Engel is a psychiatrist who works at Harvard University Health Services and has a private practice of general psychiatry in Central Square. When in April 2012, one of our 10th grade students committed suicide, Stephanie came to Commonwealth to lead a parent information and support meeting. She offered her perspectives on adolescent mental health, parenting, and stress and coping. And it was an extreme comfort to the parents to hear from an alum, actually a parent alum, and a psychiatrist about what they could do for their kids in this really difficult time. Sophie Ricks is a clinical social worker who received her MSW from the Smith School of Social Work and currently works on a medical respite unit of Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, where she manages, among other things, issues of trauma and addiction. This year, Sophie returned to Commonwealth as a guest lecturer in the Health and Community course, a health education series for 9th graders, where she shared both her personal and professional experiences with mental health issues and responded to many questions from our students. Susannah Sherry is a psychiatrist who works with children, adolescents, and adults in her private practice in Central Square and teaches in the psychiatry residency program at Cambridge Health Alliance, a teaching hospital of Harvard Medical School. Susannah was an alumni representative to Commonwealth's Board of Trustees from 2009 to 2012. And during the 2012 to 13 academic year, Susannah completed an extensive in-depth survey of the counseling and wellness programs at 5 other Boston area independent schools in order to provide us at Commonwealth with benchmarks and best practice examples as we evaluated our own student support system. Susannah's research and her recommendations became the basis for a comprehensive review and enhancement of Commonwealth's mental health and student support services. And finally, Jonathan Rotenberg describes 3 lives that he's had so far. Life number 1. In 9th grade at Commonwealth, he started the Boston Computer Society in the library, and he went on to spend the next 13 years as a nonprofit organizer of computer-related education events and consumer advocacy programs. He left the computer world in 1990 and went to Harvard Business School. He became a corporate strategy consultant inside Fortune 500 companies for the next 22 years. Life number 3, he returned to school at the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology in 2012, where he did a graduate program in executive coaching. And he's been coaching mission-driven for-profit and nonprofit leaders ever since. And Jonathan was the speaker at an all-school assembly this spring, where he shared both his professional and personal journeys with students and faculty. So I'll turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Okay. I'm Stephanie Engel, and this is an interesting event for me because I have never before spoken about myself publicly. I've given a lot of talks, and it's always been about other people. About 15 years after, can you hear me? Yeah. About 15 years after graduating from Commonwealth, I ran into a classmate on the street who asked me what I was doing with my life. I told her I had become a psychiatrist. That figures, she said, with a slightly sarcastic tone. She reminded me that we had taken a January term course, which I gather they don't exist anymore, but they were wonderful. We'd taken a January term course on Freud in our junior year, in which we had read Dora, The Interpretation of Dreams, and 3 essays on sexuality. And I had loudly proclaimed that I had found my calling. I cringed, perhaps because of its ecclesiastical overtones, or because I recognized that as a 16-year-old I had been prone to such pretentious and oracular statements. Or maybe because, despite what I had experienced as a time as a very roundabout, eccentric, and exploratory route, I had ended up exactly where all my classmates would have predicted. But I had been lost occupationally for a number of years after high school, feeling that nothing quite matched the intensity and the promise of the late 1960s at the Commonwealth School, the time that Mr. Merrill in his writings has referred to as the years of trouble. Arriving at college in the early 1970s, after the glory days of student activism had faded into bickering among what the French called groupuscules, I declared myself to be pre-med, along with 40% of my entering class, since that still seemed like a socially meaningful route that was at the same time secure and respectable. But the cutthroat competition for grades in the entry-level courses in science terrified me, and I backed out of that option quickly. I dropped out of college. I took so long to complete my undergraduate degree that both the college I had been admitted to, Radcliffe College, and my major, social relations, had been eliminated. So I stumbled out many years later with a plan to go to graduate school to study American social history, admittedly the history of psychoanalysis, with Christopher Lasch. I had a year between college and graduate school with a fellowship to do research and writing at the Radcliffe Institute. And I was reading the Boston Globe over a cup of coffee one morning when I saw an obituary of a woman who had been my best friend during childhood and a classmate at Commonwealth, although we had drifted apart by the time we had graduated. While my brain tried over and over to recast the article as a wedding announcement, it was not. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew she had died by suicide. Charles, Merrill, and I spoke at her memorial service, and I read Spring and Fall, a poem that I had learned in Mr. Chatfield's 12th grade English class. Any of you who took English 12 with Charles would remember those lines, which he loved. Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, the worlds of one would leaf meal lie, yet you will weep and know why. My friend's father, a research scientist and physician, referred to her death as the result of depression, a disease, he said, for which we have not yet discovered the cure. I was appalled. Steeped as I was in the world of psychoanalytic thinking that he would make such an evasive, defensive, and disingenuous statement. Smug was I at that time. And I would have been horrified to know that now, almost 40 years later, I would come to agree with his medicalized formulation. By the time the world then stopped swirling around me, I had written to Christopher Lasch to tell him I was not coming as a PhD student to the University of Rochester, and I enrolled in Biology 1 and Inorganic Chemistry at Harvard Extension School, was signed up as an adjunct to teach one course at Harvard called Freud on Women, and I had taken a part-time job as a nurse for the animals at the Franklin Park Zoo. 2 years later, I went to medical school, and with a brief side trip into pediatrics, I followed the overdetermined route and became a psychiatric resident at McLean Hospital, the culmination of the trifecta of Harvard College, Harvard Medical School, and a Harvard residency, which is known locally as Preparation H. So without a doubt, the psychoanalysts at McLean were the best supervisors I had in my training, and I reveled in the pleasure of close reading, which I had learned here, close reading of the language produced by my patients, and I enjoyed catching my patients and revealing slips and wordplay. And I began my own personal analysis with one of the training analysts at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute. Yet I left the brochure and application to become a candidate at the Institute untouched in my desk drawer for nearly 10 years, telling myself I would get to it when I had time. I often thought during this protracted time of putting off the training for my calling about the wonderful Grace Paley story, Once, in which Faith, who is Grace Paley's alter ego, runs into her ex-husband on the steps of the library. "Hello, my life," she says, and she begins to explain why she never got around to the chores she had meant to do, because First, my father was sick that Friday. Then the children were born. Then I had those Tuesday night meetings, you remember. Then the war began. But there were also real reasons for my foot dragging. Most of the analysts I knew were treating either very wealthy patients who could afford the high fees several times a week, or trainees themselves wanting to become analysts. The thought of becoming part of this rarefied and solipsistic world felt both deeply compelling and unbearably suffocating in equal measure. My practice went in a different direction. I have had, for many years, a mixed practice of general psychiatry in Central Square in Cambridge, treating all comers, which in Central Square includes a pretty wide swath of the human condition, from comedy to tragedy, rich and poor, insured and not. I am not a psychoanalyst, and I treat patients with psychotherapy of a very eclectic and constantly evolving sort, informed by all the experiences, readings, and patients who have come before. I have also felt increasingly drawn to treating very ill patients whose illnesses, or dare I say diseases, and shock my 22-year-old self, draw on the biological end of the biopsychosocial model of psychiatric care. I also work part-time at the Student Health Service at Harvard, where, perhaps surprisingly, the range of pathology needs and severity of problems is not very different than the rest of my practice. And yet, in recent years, I became restive, feeling that there was something increasingly missing in my work life. I stopped teaching and supervising residents because I felt I had nothing new to say, and I could not bear to hear myself repeat the suggestions I'd been making for 25 years. I had sometime earlier stopped reading journals or books in the field of psychoanalysis, and even when I went to conferences on psychotherapy, I brought the New York Times crossword puzzle, so that when I inevitably became bored, I had something to focus on. In March 2010, I came across an article about the way in which, in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, it had revealed the weaknesses of their mental health system. And it quoted the psychiatrist who was working with the Haitians through the organization Partners in Health to build a sustainable state-of-the-art mental health system. I called him, and not long after I boarded a plane to Port-au-Prince and became a volunteer with the Amis La Santé mental health team, also called Équipe Wozo, and have been consulting and teaching with them ever since. And I will shortly be going to Africa to continue this work with a very interesting locally run health center in a very isolated region in the mountains of Burundi. Although it took me until my late 50s to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, I also feel I have come full circle. Recently, as I began to prepare 6 lectures on Psychiatry 101, in French, merci à Madame Francis, the Commonwealth School French teacher, which I will soon be giving to the 5 doctors, 14 nurses, and more than 100 community health workers in this health center in Africa, I ran across astonishing data from the World Health Organization. If you discount communicable diseases like tuberculosis, HIV, or the myriad mosquito-borne illnesses, then depression is the most common cause of disability worldwide, from students at Harvard University to earthquake survivors in Haiti. And while we're finally beginning to get some clues from research in molecular biology and genetics, the statement of my deceased friend's father that so enraged me when I was a cocksure 23-year-old would-be psychoanalyst now feels so true and so powerful. Quote, "Depression is a disease for which we do not know the cure," unquote. And while etiologies and cures remain elusive, we do know some things that can help. Thoughtful psychotherapy, mindfulness techniques, medication and meditation, sunlight, sleep, and what Partners in Health has dubbed accompagnement, or being with. I feel profoundly privileged to have been able to spend my professional life accompanying, being with, those whose lives are made more difficult by diseases that have remained so resistant to understanding and to cure.
Janetta just asked me to say that unlike the other previous Merrill series, it's not going to be a Q&A until the end, so everybody is going to tell their story, and then people will take questions. Okay. So, Sophie?
Thanks. So, tough act to follow. I'll do my best. And to start off, just to apologize, I have a little bit of a cold, so if I break into a coughing fit, I will try to turn away from the mic and do my best.
Turn right to me.
Yeah, I'll turn back. So when Janetta asked me to speak tonight, at first I kind of struggled with what to talk about, and I thought back to when I was considering what to write my college essay about, and Mr. Davis gave me some advice, which was to write about something that I felt passionate about, and it didn't really matter if the audience cared what the topic was as long as I felt passionate about it. So I decided to take that advice, and I'm going to talk about working in addictions and working specifically with opioid addicts and methadone maintenance, which is probably something not too many people know a lot about, I'm hoping. So about, I guess it was around 4.5 years ago, I started working at North Charles, which is a methadone maintenance program in Somerville. I worked there for 2.5 years before transitioning to working at Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, where I work now, primarily in addictions. And both places serve patients with histories that bring new meaning to the word resilience. As one recent patient, homeless on the street in winter and summer since 1986, said, "We're all survivors in here," and it's really very true. So addiction has undoubtedly affected everyone in this room in some way or another, whether it's a friend, a family member, or a colleague. My grandmother abused prescription narcotics for decades, and I've had many friends who have struggled with addiction. But when I say the word addict, many people envision someone poor, using cocaine or heroin, unemployed, and with little to offer society. But I guarantee you there are people in here tonight who have struggled with a compulsion to keep drinking or using drugs despite severe negative consequences. We need to recognize that the mom who downs a bottle of wine and a few extra Xanax every night to sleep is struggling with the same problem as the homeless man nodding out at the bus stop, and not stigmatize him just because he chooses a different substance. But to start off, I want to explain what I mean when I say opioids. Opioids, most people know, include heroin and morphine, but the group also includes Percocet, OxyContin, fentanyl, Darvon, Vicodin, a whole host of other medications. I also want to make the distinction between addiction and dependence. Physical dependence is what would happen to any of us if we were prescribed opioids and took them long term. We would develop a tolerance, so we needed more of that medication to feel the same effect, and we would also feel withdrawal if we stopped taking that medication. Addiction, on the other hand, I think of as everything that kind of swirls around dependence. Lying, stealing, cheating, being dishonest with oneself, dishonest with other people, not able to keep up your responsibilities and be productive because of the substance, and your whole life revolving around it. So I'd like people to think back to the last time you went in for dental surgery or had an ER visit for a broken bone. Did the physician take a few minutes to inquire about your substance abuse history before prescribing you 60 oxycodone, or even warn you about the dangers of becoming physically dependent? And if they did warn you, I'm impressed. Though we prescribe more narcotic painkillers than ever before, research shows our pain is actually not being managed better, though we do have skyrocketing rates of addiction. About 9.4% of the population met criteria for substance abuse or dependence when the last survey was done in 2004. When I was in graduate school at Smith in 2009, I took a substance abuse policy and practice class, and I don't remember the word methadone being mentioned once in a full semester class, which is really pretty astounding considering that methadone is one of the most well-researched treatments for opioid addiction and has been approved for use since the mid-1960s. There's a success rate for medication-assisted treatment of around 50%, and without medication-assisted treatment, there's a relapse rate of around 90%, which is pretty astonishing. And I want to throw out a few questions just for people to kind of think about, none of which I knew the answers to, let me say, when I started working in a methadone clinic. So if I were to ask you, is methadone treatment safe for pregnant women, how many people in here would say, I confidently know the answer to that? I'm sure there's a doctor or a nurse who maybe knows. But how many people would? If you're confident that you know the answer to that, you can raise your hand if you'd like to. All right, not very many people. And if I were to ask you, can methadone be used to treat cocaine addiction, how many people would know the answer to that? And if I were to ask, is it safe for someone to drive a car or operate machinery while on methadone? So I'll come back to that. So how does it work? So methadone works by attaching to opioid receptors in the brain, effectively preventing other opioids like heroin from attaching at the same time. if you try to use heroin on top of methadone, essentially you're wasting your money. And you'll miss out on the euphoria you were hoping for. But the key to its success is really its long half-life of about 36 hours. So if you think of an analogy of blood sugar, if you have a sugary donut, your blood sugar kind of spikes up and then pretty rapidly goes down again. So then it's mid-afternoon and you decide you want a piece of chocolate or a soda, so your blood sugar goes up again and then crashes again, and you keep kind of doing that with spikes. Versus if you were to have some brown rice for lunch, it kind of slowly goes up, your blood sugar, and then it slowly comes down again. And basically, heroin is the sugary donut and methadone is the brown rice, essentially. So the advantage to methadone is that if with heroin, you might need to use heroin multiple times a day in order to feel okay, whereas with methadone, you can actually have one dose in the morning every day and be feeling completely normal. Its tolerance remains steady over time, and patients notice a diminished craving for opioids now that their receptors are effectively sated. For some patients, methadone can be a stepping stone on their way to complete abstinence, and for other patients with heavier or longer histories of drug use, maintenance therapy may help them just to feel normal, and they may need to be on it for years or do a very slow taper. The other crucial factor in methadone-assisted treatment is the counseling requirement. There's a lot of federal regulations for methadone. We often caution patients that medication on its own won't fix their addiction, and to prevent relapse, they must learn to avoid triggers like people, places, and things that are often talked about in AA that they associate with using, and for the first time, often, manage anger, sadness, and grief without a substance. One of the biggest misconceptions patients often struggle with is the idea that they're just trading one drug for another. They often hear this from family members or at AA meetings. Here's where I come back to dependence versus addiction. If my patient is taking a legally prescribed medication, showing up for work, attending parent-teacher conferences, and off probation, I find it hard to see this as equal to the dangers of heroin. When patients question, "Am I really sober, though?" I ask them about what else is still swirling around them. I ask them to consider the analogy of insulin for the diabetic. A diabetic needs insulin to feel normal. They are dependent on it to survive, but are they addicted to it? No. After years of dysregulated dopamine levels, some patients may need to be on methadone just to feel normal and to function. The research on methadone outcome shows the following. There's a reduction in death rates, there's a reduction in IV drug use, there's a reduction in crime, there's a reduction in the rate of HIV seroconversion, there's a reduction in the relapse to IV drug use, and there's improved employment, health, and social function, which is pretty impressive. But again, why is this relevant? At least 140 people have died of suspected heroin overdoses in Massachusetts recently, and opiate overdoses have risen 90% between 2000 and 2012. Rates of ER visits and substance abuse treatment admissions related to prescription opioids also increased nationwide. In 2007, opioid addiction cost insurers $72.5 billion, health and economic costs similar to asthma and HIV infection. And in March, Deval Patrick announced a public health emergency of an opioid epidemic in our state, making a commitment of $20 million to increase drug treatment and recovery services. Medication-assisted treatment is an integral part of the addiction treatment landscape, but unlike AA, if you're not yourself a heroin addict or know someone who is, you might never have even known anything about methadone. So I didn't know any of this about methadone, or really addiction, when I started working in addictions, but I started to learn very quickly from my patients. First, these simple answers, all kinds of methadone trivia and facts. Perhaps most importantly, though, that one, where trauma goes, how frequently addiction follows, and two, the very strong realization that there but by the grace of God go I. My privilege in growing up in Cambridge with two overachieving but otherwise harmless siblings and loving parents, thanks Dad, Mom, set me up for a lifetime of college, graduate school, and career rather than victimization after victimization. I would estimate that 99% of my patients at Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program have experienced at least one traumatic event, like a rape or witnessing a shooting, but sadly most of them have actually experienced multiple traumas. Ed Kansian, who's a Harvard psychiatrist, and some of his colleagues initially proposed the self-medication hypothesis, but it's hard for me to consider this as actually a hypothesis given what I see every day. So I want to give you just one kind of composite snapshot of a patient who shared their story with me. Vanessa was a 24-year-old who grew up with a father who was a ringleader of organized crime in the Charlestown projects, and whose childhood involved frequently waking up to her bedroom door being kicked in during a police raid for guns or drugs. After her mother died of cancer when she was 13 and an older sister overdosed and died on heroin, It's not too hard to understand why she looked for something to numb the pain. At the methadone clinic, she started attending a yoga group and learned to quiet her anxiety. In our early sessions, she would get up and walk around my office, picking things up off my desk and commenting on the pictures on the wall or talking about the latest manicure fashions. But when we hugged goodbye 2.5 years later, she was able to talk about her pain and her loneliness and the importance of having a place each week where she could simply be heard. If counseling was not a requirement for methadone treatment, I don't believe she would have been there. The mandate got her in the door, but the changes she saw in herself kept her there. Thank you.
So we were asked to speak on my personal journey, and this is my journey helping people to take their own journey. My father, Norman Sherry, always assumed that since his parents died young, he would too. But he went on being his warm, humorous self into his 84th year. That year he told me, "Susharino, if I can't go up the stairs, I'm sunk." And one day I got a call to come over. He had been carried upstairs, and he never went down again. He gathered us around his bedside, and he held hands with me and my sisters. He told us how much he loved us and how happy he felt that he had lived such a wonderful life, and to remember that. And later, when he was gone, I often felt suffused with his words about the good life. And I became free in my memories of him to jump around in time, became unstuck in time, to use a phrase by Kurt Vonnegut. To give you a few snapshots of these memories. I'm 6 years old. We are singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and skipping into Harvard Square and playing a game. Guess how many steps, he says, from the front of my office, he was a pediatrician, to the Colonial Drugstore. I treasured these times together, his wisdom, whimsy, and focused attention, all interwoven into Saturday morning errands. In 9th grade at Commonwealth, it's project week. I'm at the Beth Israel Hospital Psychiatry Department, watching riveted from behind a one-way screen, mirrored glass, as my father and his team clinic evaluate children to address their psychological problems. And other moments from those years. I'm immersed in reading Freud by a crackling fire. I'm in high school English class, reading every word of a Robert Frost poem, "Tree at My Window, Window Tree," and in Mr. Davis's first year of teaching, a Hemingway story, "The Cat in the Rain." I can still feel the plaintive yearning and hear the rain pattering in the piazza. Through such close readings, I learned the value of attending to fine details, how the words conjure images and reveal the deepest of meanings. At Hancock, we have an art class in the barn. Rusty Crump is asking the class to notice my choice of blue-gray shading in my drawing. These memories highlight what children need to thrive, role models and opportunities for creativity, mastery, and pride. I recently had occasion to read Freud's paper, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through. It's about how people recreate life events and conflicts out of awareness. Freud's ideas to help them remember their past and what they hadn't really forgotten after all. You may ask yourself, how did I get here? Same as it ever was, same as it ever was. I ask myself that. What am I doing back here? Back at high school. I'm in the lunchroom. I could almost be a teenager again. When I got offered a spot at Harvard, I was torn. I needed to leave home, to leave Cambridge. Judith Zaporin helped me decide. I took one of several years off after high school graduation so I could leave and return. My sister was taking a course on unconscious defense mechanisms. She taught me the meaning of reaction formations, saying, for example, it's hard for you to leave, so you go really far away. I found myself in the frozen tundra of Alaska and the desert in the Sinai. In both cases, I was working with children in need, deaf kids, and kibbutznik children, though I did turn down a Santa's elf job in Anchorage. My own experiences resonate with what I've read and what I learned from patients about the process of growing up, where we start and how we progress, retaining our own stamp of selfhood, identifying with parents and teachers, yet defining ourselves as separate. Donald Winnicott wrote, "Does a normal child just eat and grow and smile sweetly? No, If he has confidence in mother and father, he tries out his power to disrupt, to destroy, to frighten, to wear down. At the start, he absolutely needs to live in a circle of love and strength with consequent tolerance if he is not to be too fearful of his own thoughts. Infants are born with capacities for attachment. Their reflexes are designed to grasp and suck. They have an innate interest in gazing at faces and can imitate facial expressions. Over 2 years, they acquire symbolic thought with their first words in association with growth and specialization of different parts of the brain. Expanding my own horizons, I wanted to pursue growth and development professionally, and I was torn in medical school between pediatrics and psychiatry. First, I trained in pediatrics. The work was hands-on, often gratifying, intense. We were weaning tiny premature babies off ventilators, arresting seizures, combating infection. I remember staving off death for a child with sepsis. Rapidly covered in purple spots, he lost his leg but survived the night. Despite some terrible moments, I liked the chance to rescue and take action, but I wanted more focus on the relational aspects of the field, as I'd seen in my father's team clinic. Between residencies, I traveled to the Marshall Islands, coral atolls in the middle of the Pacific, where I worked as a pediatrician and was indelibly influenced by new cultural perspectives. I'll give you one example. After a young man with asthma suddenly died during the night, I had a revelatory moment, finally understanding Marshallese, Kajamajal, when a boy asked me, "Ko promise con lagi?" Are you sad about Lucky? Of course I was. We had given him asthma medicine, and he had brought us a dinner of fresh fish the night before. And asking if I cared, the boy invited me to join the morning community, sitting together for 24 hours by Lucky's body, eating homemade donuts and telling stories. In psychiatry, we image the brain and imagine the mind. Sometimes you can trace a symptom to its biological origin, such as infectious brain disease, hypothyroidism, anemia, vitamin deficiencies. Over 100 years ago, psychiatry hospitals were full of patients with syphilis. Also central to treatment is the empathic connection, not sympathy per se, but presence with, understanding, accepting, and coming to know the other. There is the challenge of feelings that threaten to engulf: anger, paranoia, despair. The dangers of actions for many patients: violence and suicide. We are holding the risk. We use our own emotions as data, and our patients inhabit us. We have to have humility about our limits and optimism about our possibilities. I'll tell some vignettes of composite patients to preserve confidentiality. I saw a 10-year-old girl with anxiety. For no apparent reason, she couldn't go to school. I learn after a few months that her mother has nursed a family friend through the final stages of terminal cancer. In a family meeting, she asks her father, "Why didn't you ever cry?" When her father acknowledges the loss, her symptoms begin to recede. A moody 3-year-old, coping with family conflict at home, enters the office and creates disaster in the dollhouse. And then the superhero rescues the children, over and over again. He leaves each session with a lighter step, imbued with his own power. A 15-year-old with newly diagnosed ADHD responds well to a stimulant and can finally complete all of his homework and feel a taste of success. An elderly woman suffers with depression despite her Lexapro, but after switching to Wellbutrin, she smiles for the first time in a year. We consider mind and brain and integrate models to best understand them both, as they do encompass the whole person. If the patient engages from that close emotional involvement, we can make meaningful comments, interpretations. If we feel moved, or sometimes even cry too, that is a sign that the treatment is moving forward. We bear witness. A person speaking the unspeakable can transform inchoate experience into a story that makes sense. And so, having looked backwards at my childhood inspirations and at what propelled me forward along my path to the present, I approach the end of my story. Lastly, on the power of imagination, despite our mortality, I'd like to quote from The Tempest. Like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherits shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.
Trusty iPhone here. So I'm feeling very overwhelmed and humbled. This is the first panel I've ever been on mental health and wellness, and I'm feeling like a little bit of an imposter. And I guess I have probably had this feeling for a while, but I've been thinking about, well, how did I actually get here? Being one of the few Commonwealth alums that I think went to the dark side and went to Harvard Business School and worked inside of all those evil companies that do terrible things. And I mean, I guess the first step is, admitting the shame and, I think we're accepting here. But, actually, I think my story, I'm not going to make this, don't get scared when I say this, but I think it starts probably around age 4 or 5, when adults always seemed to feel very comfortable telling me whatever was on their mind. And I didn't necessarily understand what they were talking about, but somehow I seemed to be this person that was very safe to talk to, and I would listen, and they would feel better. And so I actually had this idea for years that I would be some kind of counselor or therapist someday. And I guess one of the reasons that never happened was I, having been a major consumer of the therapy industry, I'm just, I have a frequent therapy card. I had brought the idea up to someone I had spent a lot of time with, and every time I mentioned, I think maybe what I want to be as a therapist or a counselor, there was this sort of silence, and it wasn't like a good silence, it wasn't like a smile, and I sort of thought, okay, well, I guess I have too many problems for that field. So the other thing that happened was I went to Cambridge Friends School, and the headmaster there was a guy named Tim Barclay, who was a trustee of Commonwealth. And I just loved computers when I was in 7th grade, which was not that unusual today for a 7th grader to be all into computers. And he managed to sneak me into Commonwealth, which was this place that had a teletype hooked up to a PDP-8 time-sharing system that was the most amazing thing imaginable. So my big ingenious plan was to go to Commonwealth School because they had a computer. And I got here in the fall of 1976, and the computer had disappeared over the summer after I had accepted, and my parents had paid the check and everything. And ironically, I think about, I'm very much of a planner, and this is sort of maybe the theme of my life, is this saying that people plan, God laughs. And so I think this has sort of been the whole journey. So I planned to come here because I'm interested in computers. And so what happened was this friend of mine and I tried to convince the school to buy a microcomputer, which was probably not a very good idea at that point because you had to solder these things together in kit form. But that frustration of the lack of information led to starting the Boston Computer Society, and then suddenly being at the ground floor of this huge industry, and then ending up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and building this, having this international organization, and knowing people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs when they were like 4 feet tall, and hanging out with all these, bigwigs and stuff. So I had this glamorous life, and then I was going to do that for the rest of my life, and then it turned out I didn't really know what I was doing, and definitely needed someone with some professional experience. So I left. I had no idea what to do, and I went actually the day after the Boston Computer Society. I had never been on a camping trip in my life, and I decided, okay, I'm going to do Outward Bound. And I spent 23 days off the coast of Maine in May, And I don't, how many people have done Outward Bound?
I did it in May and it was so cold.
Oh my God, okay.
It was, and you had to jump in the water every day.
Right, right.
It was a nightmare.
Every, yeah, well, I mean, you know, if they told you what you were going to do, like no one would do it, and that's why they don't give you any of the information. It's so you have to run and swim every day. The water's 46 degrees. And the amazing thing was that no one died in my group. But so part of the experience is they put you on a deserted island by yourself in the middle of whatever, some Penobscot Bay, thank you. And I actually decided to start my own government. That was my idea from Commonwealth. But I was at this place of what am I going to do with my life? And I realized as I sat on my island, and there was two really clear ideas. And the main one was I wanted to become a guidance counselor for like a high school or college guidance counselor. And the other idea was to go to Harvard Business School. And the weirdest thing happened. I came home and I'm like, I want to go to Harvard Business School. And it sort of didn't make sense. And when I told people, they were like, what? That's not you. You're very idealistic and that sounds awful. But I guess, at the time what I was thinking is, well, my life has been so nice in the nonprofit world and everyone treats me so nicely. I am going to get killed in the real world. So I thought, this will like toughen me up. And it just, I don't know, it sort of got worse and worse. And I went into management consulting and working 90-hour weeks. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but like to help companies, take like 5 cents out of their cost structure and put some competitor out of business and the sort of stuff that you think about. And I remember, so one of my shining moments was working at AT&T corporate headquarters when we had been working literally like 90-hour weeks on a project. And my dream was I woke up in the morning on the couch of this corporate vice president and used his private bathroom. And I'm like, this isn't very funny, is it? But it's like, it's kind of funny anyway, you're in management consulting, but somehow that experience led to a conversation where we're sort of all like, is this what life is about? A lot of people I discovered are on this sense of there's a sort of a spiritual depletion in their life and they're looking for something more. And so I read this book called The Celestine Prophecy and kind of fast forward, I started to get into meditation, spent 3 months in silent meditation retreats. Things got better and better with my career to where I was with this firm that got bought and there was all these layoffs going on. And I remember being at this dinner where they're like, we are the most amazing group in the company, the most profitable, the highest revenue. We are going places. And then 2 days later, I was fired. And that's corporate America. They just decided to get out of our business. And so I, on this journey, discovered this thing called executive coaching. And a Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology offers a graduate certificate program in it. And so this has been a very interesting journey. I guess the first thing was I met with a spiritual advisor. This sounds very Hollywood, but this was like a real spiritual advisor. And I said, I never understood why did I make that decision on that island to go to Harvard Business School? And he said to me, well, think about it. If you have a cup of water and you're standing by the ocean, no one is going to notice you. But if you take that cup of water and walk into a desert, you have something that's pretty important. And so the analogy that he was making was the desert being corporate America, and that maybe bringing sort of kindness and caring and a different perspective, that maybe that's where my ministry is. And then it started to occur to me, well, where does all of this mental illness come from that keeps everyone in business? It's corporate America, that works people to death and then, defines how much, how many parts of our society work. So that started to make sense. And I guess the big part of this journey for me, though, it is sort of like trying to put this in 2 minutes. It's like 30 years of this kind of spiritual investigation. But ultimately, there's something going on where psychology has been coming from the realm of looking at sort of mental health as a sort of medicine disease model and curing a problem. Buddhism has an entirely different model of psychology, and there's actually a whole field of Buddhist psychology, and everything is the opposite. Like in Western psychology, we're all about building a self, and in Buddhist psychology, it's no self. It's getting rid of everything. And when you start to put those things together and you spend a lot of time meditating, and a fascinating thing happens is like your own stuff just comes up and you just kind of work at it and work at it. So I'm seeing this thing, which is that I believe so profoundly that every single one of us here, and your children and all of your friends, every one of us comes into this world with an utterly unique set of gifts that each of you have and that no one else has ever had in history and no one will ever have again. And so looking at it this way, I feel like our opportunity, and what I think about as a coach, but I'm hoping ultimately is much more than executive coaching, is that we have been looking for all of the solutions outside to poverty and homelessness and so many different things, that maybe the next stage is really looking within. And as we kind of get underneath layers and layers and we find what is really here and that greatness, that's what I think is going to take us forward. And I'm actually writing a book now about Steve Jobs, who was kind of, even though he seemed like a real jerk, I think was onto a lot of insight about this sort of thing. So I feel like there's some big things happening, and since this is my first time on one of these things, I hope you'll forgive me if I don't really have it figured out yet, but it seems like a very, very exciting time to be sort of thinking about health and well-being and kind of where it goes as we are less focused on kind of making more trouble in the world and maybe trying to really see the greatness that we each have, and maybe that we already have the solutions there to discover.
Yeah, people want to ask questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really interested to hear from some or all of you your opinions about the decriminalization and legalization of marijuana and the increased prevalence of marijuana use, and how you see that affecting mental health.
Good question. That sounds like a Sophie question.
Well, I have to say that given that I see so many patients who have just come out of jail, sometimes for violent offenses and sometimes more frequently for nonviolent offenses like trespassing or urinating on the street or things like this, it feels like we're just filling up our jails needlessly when we do have laws that criminalize marijuana use. But I'm also aware that marijuana is still the #1 gateway drug for teenagers, especially. Opioids are coming up close behind, which is pretty scary. If your teenager is smoking pot, they probably aren't gonna, do anything more than eat a bunch of donuts or chips. They're not gonna develop a habit where they're ending up overdosing. But I feel kind of torn about it. Where I work right now, I work right across from Boston Medical Center, which is kind of the free care hospital. And then down the street we have the methadone clinic. We have a Cumberland Farms that just opened, which is sort of the hot spot for buying and selling drugs now across the street. And then we're between kind of two shelters, and one of the proposed medical marijuana sites is right near us. So we're kind of in like a Bermuda Triangle sort of thing. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be a good thing for our patients, but I also am a big proponent of harm reduction. And so for some patients or some people in general, using marijuana is beneficial as opposed to using heroin or using cocaine or using anything else to relax. So if people haven't heard of the term harm reductions, is basically, it's what it sounds like. Basically, this would be the idea of giving somebody methadone instead of heroin, having sex workers have condoms available so that if they are going to be having sex, that they're going to protect themselves. And so it's sort of a lesser of two evils idea. I don't know if I'm being concise enough, but that's my request.
Maybe we should move on to another question. That was a good answer, but I want to make sure people have a chance to ask.
Good comment, and just thank you for doing all this. This is excellent. And I'm particularly interested in the opioid epidemic. I'm a physiatrist. I was at the National Opioid Summit in Atlanta, the Prescription Opioid Summit recently, and it was really humbling. I'm a physician who was underrepresented there, and it was the people who were dealing with the downstream damage. It was the law enforcement. It was a lot of people, community youth directors, and people treating addiction and all that. And it was very enlightening to hear you talk about methadone and the medical treatments for addiction. So my hope is that we'll basically as doctors will finally get it and stop prescribing 30 Percocet for every wisdom teeth extraction and bunionectomy and so on. But it's just so easy for doctors to do that, and I talk to my colleagues all the time, and we've got a long way to go. So you as patients should be questioning your doctors every time they try to write that script and say, I really don't think I need that, and those sorts of things, and make sure you know how to dispose of this stuff. But and if you don't mind, I'll comment on the marijuana thing too. I think that was all over the place there at that conference, and there is a recent study that shows that young people do have cognitive deficits as a result of it changes the development of the brain. So anyone under 25 will have less myelination of the nerve endings in the brain and so on, and it will affect the prefrontal cortex and so on. So it does affect cognition. It affects children particularly, and young adults. So it's not a good thing. But I agree that harm reduction. I look at that. It's probably less harmful than the opioids for people who are in chronic pain. So. I'm concerned that the pill mill or the marijuana places are just going to be a new opportunity for docs to just who are retired from whatever, and they just open up this shop, and they're already opening where you just go in with your old MRI scans, and you pay your $200 and you get your medical marijuana card. So it's a racket. It's going to be a racket, and we're going to be dealing with the ramifications of that. But hope you don't mind if I took the stage on that. But any other comments about that? I'm really concerned about the marijuana, but I think you're right that it's probably lesser of two evils for some people.
Back there?
Yeah, I have a question for any one of you, and I thank you all for sharing your stories with us. I'm a primary care pediatrician, but my question is for those of us who are in primary care, or for teachers, or for parents. What would your suggestions be for us? What do we look for in our relationships with adolescents? What are the warning signs that we should be aware of that would lead us to a referral, to further work up for a child who we think is or an adolescent who's not doing well and perhaps is going in the wrong direction?
Good question. Susannah, do you want to?
Sure. I think this will all sound familiar to you, Rob, but if there are any signs of depression, to ask some screening questions about depression, about anxiety, overall functioning, and if there are any signs of depression, problems with concentration, sleep, appetite, low self-esteem, pleasure in life, falling grades, deterioration in functioning, problems with peers, friendships, also specifically to ask about thoughts of self-harm, self-injury that might not be with intent to die, but still an important part of the person's history, substance abuse, and to be aware which of those are risk factors for seriously hurting yourself, because not all of them are, but a lot of them are. And to have a sense about the timeline and how severe it is, so the difference between somebody having a reaction to something that was hard in life versus really having a major depression that's more sustained and severe and prolonged. or suffering from severe anxiety or substance abuse, problems with reality testing of any sort, traumas, family problems. It's such a long list, it's hard to encompass it all, but I think a lot of it you gain from the experience of being with kids routinely, so that when you ask about friendships, you start off asking about things that will engage the teenager in the conversation. So, what are the favorite things to do? And you might have a sense already that they're following sports, or that they're following some event in the news, or their favorite music, what concerts are happening, and so you sort of get into the conversation in a way that makes them eager to be talking to you, hopefully, or at least not as opposed as some might be. And then from that vantage point, it's much easier to engage them in a conversation about what might be difficult. And lots of times I think people are afraid to ask hard questions, feeling that they'll kind of stir up trouble, but it's really more the other way around, that it's really valuable to go over some specific details, which most of the time kids will answer truthfully about dangerous situations they might be in any of these regards. And also not to be afraid to get a consultation or evaluation. It's not the same as committing them to months and months of treatment to say, see what you think about the situation. Does this kid need treatment or not? And then that's part of the therapist's job, to answer that question. Not everybody does, so then you get a second opinion about that.
I'd add one thing to that, which is, and I think I said this when I did the consultation here when there was a suicide, which is that I think having a school like this one where every kid has an advisor who, and the advisor knows the child well, is probably the most important thing a school can do. And I think the school cannot be doing depression screening on every child. That's not the school's role. But I think most of the kids here are well known by at least one adult, and that is probably the most important thing that can happen. And then there are always students who do not reveal what's going on. And we've had that at Harvard multiple times when students have an advisor, they have a therapist, they have a proctor, and no one has any idea, and they've asked the questions. So I think, we also have to be humble about not being able to identify every child in trouble.
I have a general question. It's more a Commonwealth question than a question for the panel. But is there training for the teachers associated with mental health awareness? And this may be more Deborah's role to comment on that, but I'd really like to hear about it. I think it's critically important.
Sure, that's a great question, because, like pediatricians, the teachers really are the kind of first responders. They're on the front lines with the kids. They're the people that the kids are going to go to. So there's a number of things that go on. A lot of it is informal, so through relationships with individual teachers, I'm continually educating people about what to look for, giving them feedback about specific situations. Teachers feel, I think, very able to come and ask for help when they need it, and they're astute observers of the kids and get all kinds of information that, frankly, I would probably never have access to. So a lot of it goes on informally, just through the day-to-day process. And we've done some trainings, different things. We certainly had some people come in after the suicide to talk to teachers about that particular topic because it was such a trauma. We've had some workshops that we've done for Faculty Development Day about boundaries and kind of observing, interpersonal boundaries with kids and learning about the meaning of that and the utility of that. So, we do try to educate the teachers, and the people are very interested in mental health. And actually, the kids are very interested in learning more about mental health. And so, in the past, I would say a year or so, we've had a meeting with a group of kids who are really interested in learning more. I've been in health and community class, as has Sophie, to talk to kids about mental health issues. So I think the school in general is very savvy about that stuff and very eager to learn more. Yeah.
If I can just add too, what is interesting, one of the other things we talk to teachers about is recognizing when they're getting, and they're by and large really very good about it, about recognizing the point at which they do need to pass the problem off. Because it's very, when you have that kind of relationship with a kid, when you're talking once a week, it's very easy to get drawn unwittingly into a relationship that you find is therapeutic. And that's something that we are cautious about, very cautious about. What I found fascinating about this conversation, that list of treatments, you know, from medication to sunlight to mindfulness to relationship. I mean, it's essentially a bag of tricks. I mean, a toolbox, and deciding which one is appropriate at which time. And it's absolutely fascinating in running a school. We want to care for the kids. We have to recognize we're not a therapeutic institution. And so it's very easy to get into seeing every problem as a medical issue that can be cured, but then we have to switch over to the other framework that we are running a school, and there are limits to what we can do, and there are times we have to take tough and difficult decisions when we realize something ultimately isn't working. But I mean, how do you know how do you decide or know when to put down this tool and pick up that one? You know, the mix, you're always, what you were talking about is as much, as you said, reading as it is science.
How do I, as a clinician?
Yes.
I will use more rather than less. Because, you know, the sort of wellness, particularly adolescents and students, the wellness piece is incredibly important. So they all need more exercise, more sunshine, more sleep. I mean, I talk endlessly about sleep. I think the issue is when it is a serious mental illness and when intervention with medication is really important. And I think that's an important issue in the educational area, because I think you do a tremendous amount that is healing for kids with adjustment problems, inner conflicts and all of that. And I think you have to know when, you know, this is beyond something that you really understand, and you're very fortunate to be in an area where there are, you know, most of your kids have health insurance, they probably all have health insurance, and there are tremendous resources in the area. And I would say, you know, when something feels just not right, I would refer. And I think, you know, you have to preserve your role as an educational institution, which is what you do, you know, incredibly well. And there are lots of people to do the other piece.
Also, part of it is based on a clinical sense of that individual, but we try to use research and try to make a diagnosis for a person, which lots of times people don't exactly fit into a diagnostic category, but sometimes they clearly do. So sometimes there's gray zone situations, say for example with medication, where you're thinking, well, this might help, we could see, but lots of times there's situations where at least you could say, with ADHD, with psychosis, depends how high the stakes are also, with major depression, this is the likelihood that this presentation will respond. And then you look at family history and the response rate in that situation, and you try to think about what else might be going on that's left maybe unexplored. And those kinds of things will help guide you in the direction of what recommendation to make. And sometimes it also depends on what the patient or the parents are open to as well. So sometimes a family and a kid might come in and say, well, we will not consider medication. So you might be in a situation where you'd say, I really think you should, but lots of times you think, okay, well, that's how they're feeling right at the moment, so let's engage what is available to us around what they want to do, if that's likely to work. So other times you get a sense pretty quickly, you meet the child, maybe you meet the parents too, that it's what we call a dynamic situation, which is kind of a funny, specific use of the word dynamic, but where you think there's certain patterns in the way this person is relating, and the way maybe their family's relating
to them, which is really good. It's really addressing this is what's going to be really helpful to them. And so you're really guided by clinical experience and research and teaching.
One more, okay, so right in the back there.
So I have a quick one. Sophie, what's the answer to whether you can take methadone if you're pregnant?
So the answer is that yes, methadone and Suboxone are kind of the gold standard for treatment, and if you suddenly stop using opioids while you're pregnant, you're at high risk for miscarriage. So yes, absolutely. And as far as the machinery and the car parts, when you're being induced on methadone, so when you're first starting, we recommend usually that people, don't do things like that right away. But if you're on the right dose of methadone, no one should be able to tell looking at you that you're on methadone if you're on the right dose. And the second one was about cocaine, and no, if you use cocaine while you're on methadone, it actually kind of cuts the effect of methadone, so you feel like you're on a lower dose. So those are your true false answers.